The white daisies fell one by one into Clara's lap, the exact second the weathered wooden gate creaked along the gravel driveway. It was not merely the sudden, familiar groan of aged cedar hinges that made her slender fingers tremble uncontrollably. It was the tall silhouette framed against the warm, amber glow of that late May afternoon in the rolling countryside of Virginia. A tall man stood framed by the setting sun, his broad shoulders squared with an unmistakable posture, moving with a steady, resolute stride that Clara would have recognized across 1,000 lifetimes. The rubber wheels of her wheelchair sank slightly into the damp garden soil, and for a breathless moment, the entire world seemed to freeze among the blossoming blue hydrangeas. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs, but it was not purely out of joy. The initial impulse, overpowering and desperate, was an urge to flee, to let the basket of freshly cut flowers tumble to the ground, spin the metal hand rims, and retreat deep inside the farmhouse before he could get close enough to see everything. "This was why I stopped writing," she whispered under her breath, her voice breaking into a dry, fragile rasp that was instantly swallowed by the evening breeze. The pale petals scattered across the dark loam around her wheels, bright white and yellow against the dark, rich earth. Jack was about 50 paces away, and with every deliberate step he took across the grass, the face she had preserved in her memory through 10 long, agonizing years became impossibly sharp and real. His hair was cropped far shorter now, dusted with silver at the temples, his jawline noticeably harder, and his weathered skin darkened by years under foreign suns. Yet his hazel eyes remained entirely unchanged, filled with the same steady warmth she had dreamed of every single night. It was when those eyes lowered from her face, tracing down to the steel frame and the motionless legs resting beneath her woolen skirt, that Jack abruptly stopped walking. He stood frozen in the middle of the garden path, flanked by the sprawling heirloom rose bushes that Clara's mother had planted decades ago. Clara watched the exact second the agonizing reality settled into his mind, witnessing the proud composure of the decorated army colonel crumble from within. She watched his eyes glaze over with sudden moisture beneath the golden rays of the southern dusk, a man who had survived overseas deployments and climbed through the ranks of command, now faltering completely before a woman in a wheelchair surrounded by dropped flowers. What tightened her throat into an unbearable knot was her inability to discern whether those rising tears were born of enduring love or suffocating pity. Between love and pity, Clara felt with every fiber of her soul that she would have preferred never to see his face again. Clara lowered her gaze to her lap, clutching the few remaining stems in her trembling palms, while an overwhelming heat rushed to her cheeks. It had been 10 long years since anyone had looked at her with that kind of intensity. Not with the gentle resignation of kind-hearted country neighbors, nor with the quiet worry of her aging mother, but with the full, unyielding weight of an ancient promise made in the innocence of youth. She pressed the fragile daisies tightly against her chest, as though the simple petals could somehow shield her from the vulnerability of the moment. When she finally forced herself to look up, Jack had resumed his approach, moving slowly and cautiously, like someone drawing near an injured creature in the wild, terrified of startling it into a retreat she could no longer physically make. "Clara," he breathed, speaking only her name. Yet within those 2 syllables lived an entire lifetime of unsaid truths. It carried the memory of the 20-year-old girl he had kissed farewell at the train depot, the hundreds of letters he had penned by lantern light in distant military posts, and the 10 years of baffling silence that had worn away at his spirit without an explanation. His deep voice was thick and raspy. "Clara, it is me." I know who you are, Jack, she answered, struggling with all her might to keep her tone cool and steady, exactly as she had practiced in the countless imaginary conversations she had rehearsed in the dark. But her voice quavered softly, betraying a decade of buried longing and unspoken grief. You should not have come back here. Jack stopped once more, now standing only 3 short paces away, close enough that the scent of well-worn leather, clean soap, and highway dust drifting from his service uniform reached her senses. The low sun cast long shadows across the yard, highlighting the deep lines etched around his eyes and the quiet maturity time had carved into his features. Time had marched on for both of them, but while his years had been spent across strategic maps and decorated honors, hers had unfolded entirely within the confines of a wheelchair and a quiet family homestead. I gave you my word that I would come back, Jack said softly, and the tear he had been holding back finally escaped, tracing a silent line down his sunburnt cheek. I promised you. People make a great many promises when they are 20 years old and know nothing of the world, Clara replied, turning her face toward the distant fields of hay, avoiding his piercing gaze at all costs. You kept your word. You came back to check. You can leave now with a completely clear conscience. Purified, yet even as the harsh words left her lips, every hidden corner of her heart silently begged him to disobey, to stay planted right where he was, to look upon her for just a few moments longer before life resumed its quiet, lonely cadence of garden chores, her mother's fading health, the ticking mantel clock, and the slow wait for old age to take its course. Jack did not turn around, nor did he take a single step backward toward the road. Instead, he did the one thing Clara had never envisioned in all her years of solitary reflection. He dropped slowly down onto both knees right there in the soft Virginia soil, completely heedless of his pressed dress uniform and the dark garden dampness seeping into the fabric of his trousers. He lowered himself until he was at her exact eye level, looking upward into her face in the very same way she was now forced to look upon the rest of the world. From that shared vantage point, Jack offered her a tender, tear-filled smile that was undeniably real. You were always the most stubborn soul in the entire county, he said in a gentle murmur. I am grateful to see the passing years could not take that away from you. Clara remained silent, letting the quiet country evenings speak where words failed them both. Around them, the late spring landscape continued its timeless rhythm. A bumblebee hovered above a cluster of blue hydrangeas. A songbird called from the high branches of an ancient oak tree, and the sweet perfume of climbing roses mingled with the damp smell of freshly watered soil. It was a beautiful garden, nurtured through countless long afternoons by her own hands, and there were times when she truly believed it was the only living thing left in this world that flourished because of her existence. Now, seeing Jack kneeling before her in the dirt, Clara felt hot tears prickling behind her eyelids and resented herself for showing weakness. Go away, Jack, she pleaded in a fragile whisper. Please, I am no longer the Clara you left behind at the station. Jack reached out his right hand with infinite patience, picking up one of the fallen daisies from the damp loam. He gently spun the green stem between his calloused fingers, hands shaped by duty and physical labor that Clara remembered from their youthful days. With profound care, he laid the daisy back into her lap beside the others. I did not travel all these miles to find the girl I left behind 10 years ago, Jack said, his voice ringing with quiet certainty. I came back to meet the woman you have become. He stood up slowly, brushed the clinging soil from his knees without haste, and cast his gaze across the vibrant rows of blossoms. Your garden is magnificent, Clara. Did you plant all of this yourself? She could not find her voice to answer, merely nodding once before turning her gaze away, terrified that looking into his eyes for another second would completely break the emotional dam she had maintained for a decade. The sun began its final descent behind the distant Blue Ridge Mountains, painting the horizon in soft hues of crimson and gold. Jack remained standing beside her, silent and unmoving, demanding nothing and forcing no explanations, simply offering his quiet presence. It was in that very moment Clara realized, with a mixture of overwhelming terror and fragile hope, that this man had not crossed an ocean and traveled thousands of miles only to surrender at the first sight of sorrow. He had returned with every intention of staying, and that was precisely what frightened her the most. The modest home Clara inhabited was the very same wooden farmhouse where she had taken her first breath, situated at the end of a long gravel lane that branched off the main county road. It was a single-story clapboard house painted in faded blue, with a wide front porch where generations of her family had gathered on humid summer evenings to share sweet iced tea and watch the evening light settle across the pastures. Now, the old house sheltered only Clara and her 82-year-old mother, Martha, a woman whose hands had grown stiff and trembling with advanced age, but whose wit and discernment remained as sharp as a newly honed kitchen knife. The two women survived on a modest government pension, the small yield of their vegetable garden, and the revenue Clara earned from hand-woven shawls and blankets, which a neighbor transported to the local Saturday farmers market in his pickup truck. The morning following Jack's unexpected arrival began in the exact same manner as every day that had preceded it for a decade. Clara woke before the first light of dawn, using the considerable strength in her arms, developed through 10 years of constant pushing and lifting, to transfer herself from the mattress into her wheelchair. She rolled quietly down the hallway toward the kitchen, put on a fresh kettle of water, brewed a pot of strong black coffee, and warmed the milk over the iron stove before slicing the sourdough loaf she had baked 2 days prior. The comforting aroma of toasted bread and fresh coffee filled the warm kitchen, allowing her, for a few fleeting minutes, to convince herself that the previous evening had merely been an unusually vivid, melancholic dream. "You have a strange look about you this morning, Clara," Martha said between small bites of buttered crust, her sharp, dark eyes studying her daughter from across the small oak table. "Did you toss and turn all night?" "I slept just fine, Mother," Clara replied quietly, staring intently into her coffee cup as she stirred a spoonful of sugar. "Eat your breakfast before it gets cold." "I see," Martha murmured, unconvinced for a single second, yet far too wise to press the matter directly. She took a slow sip from her porcelain cup, letting the silence settle between them until she casually remarked, "I could have sworn I heard a strange vehicle idle out by the mailbox yesterday evening just before sundown." Clara's hands froze instantly against the tabletop. She drew in a slow, careful breath, gazing out through the kitchen window toward the garden where the fallen daisies still rested on the dark earth. "It was only a traveler who took the wrong turn off the county highway," Clara lied softly, her throat constricting. "I told him the main road was 3 miles back." Martha chewed thoughtfully, her weathered face completely impassive as she watched her daughter's averted gaze. A mother's heart possesses an innate knowing that requires no verbal confirmation, but the old woman simply nodded gently and returned to her meal, storing the truth away with the quiet patience of someone who understands that the most important harvests in life can never be rushed. After clearing the morning dishes, Clara wheeled herself into the small back room that had once served as a household pantry, which she had long since converted into her private weaving workshop. Along the pine-paneled walls hung skeins of natural wool dyed in soft earth tones, colors she extracted herself using walnut hulls, wild marigolds, and oak bark gathered from the nearby woods. A sturdy wooden table loom occupied the center of the room, surrounded by woven baskets of yarn and shelves stacked with neatly folded blankets, table runners, and patterned shawls. This small room was Clara's sanctuary. Seated before the wide window overlooking the backyard, she felt entirely whole. Her legs were not needed here, where her skilled hands moved across the wooden frame, interlacing warp and weft to create intricate beauty from simple threads, an art passed down to her by her grandmother. Yet on this particular morning, her rhythm was completely broken. Clara would pick up a wooden shuttle only to set it down a moment later. She would begin a new row of weaving only to pull the threads apart in frustration. Every few minutes, her eyes were drawn involuntarily toward the window, scanning the long gravel driveway to see if a tall figure would appear against the morning light. She hated herself for the foolish spark of hope flickering within her chest. A stubborn ember she thought she had extinguished 10 years ago at the cost of immense personal anguish. It had taken months of silent weeping to stop staring at the empty driveway after her injury, and years to banish his face from her dreams, yet a single sunset had undone a decade of carefully built defenses. The memory of the accident returned unbidden, as it always did whenever her inner guard slipped. She had been 23 years old, and Jack had already been serving abroad for 3 years. On a bright, cloudless Sunday afternoon, her entire future had been shattered in an instant when a heavy farm truck lost its brakes on a sharp gravel bend, crashing into her small car. The harsh screech of metal, the sterile white ceiling of the hospital room in Richmond, and the doctor's grim prognosis had fallen upon her like lead, a severe spinal injury that would leave her unable to walk for the rest of her days. Lying in that hospital bed, imagining Jack stationed across the globe with a brilliant military career ahead of him, Clara had made the agonizing decision that had haunted her ever since. She resolved that she would never become a burden tied around his neck, dragging down the promising life of the man she adored. He deserved a partner who could walk proudly beside him at formal military galas, dance with him at summer fairs, and keep pace with his boundless ambitions, not an invalid bound to a chair in a secluded Virginia farmhouse. That cruel label had embedded itself deeply within her spirit. When Jack's next letter arrived in the mail, postmarked from an overseas base, Clara left it unopened. She did not reply to that letter, nor the one that followed 3 weeks later, nor any of the dozens that arrived over the following year. She gathered them all into a vintage metal biscuit tin and let the silence accomplish what her voice lacked the cruelty to say. That tin box remained hidden in the bottom drawer of her wardrobe, wrapped securely in an old calico cloth, holding dozens of letters penned in his familiar compact script with foreign postage stamps, sleeping like a buried heart that stubbornly refused to cease beating. On her most desolate evenings, Clara would take the tin into her lap, tracing the faded pattern of the cloth without opening it, weeping in absolute silence so her mother would not hear. It was the only indulgence of love she permitted herself, a love locked away where it could bring harm to no one but herself. Outside, the quiet morning moved forward. A neighbor's hound barked in the distance, and a gentle southern breeze carried the fresh scent of clover across the porch. Taking up a spool of wheat-colored wool, Clara's hands began to weave an intricate pattern almost on instinct, realizing with a sudden ache that she was creating the delicate border of a bridal shawl, the very design she had dreamed of crafting for herself a lifetime ago when a young soldier had promised to marry her beneath the shade of the old oak tree. A rhythmic scratching sound from the garden suddenly pulled her from her thoughts. Her heart leaping into her throat, Clara carefully maneuvered her chair to the window pane. There he was. Jack had returned, dressed in a simple white work shirt with the sleeves rolled to his forearms and faded denim trousers replacing his formal uniform. He was kneeling diligently among the flower beds, gently gathering the bruised daisies from the previous evening and using a hand trowel to replant and settle the disturbed earth around their roots. He worked in complete, focused silence, entirely unaware of her gaze, handling the fragile green stems with an unexpected gentleness that contrasted sharply with his broad, soldierly frame. Behind the glass, Clara pressed the unfinished woolen shawl tightly against her chest, the tears flowing freely down her cheeks, unable to decipher whether she was weeping from a resurgence of grief or the terrifying dawn of hope. Jack did not knock on the front door that morning, nor did he ask to be invited inside. He demanded no explanations for a decade of silence and sought no apologies. He simply tended to the overgrown garden beds with quiet dedication. When the afternoon sun climbed high, Martha walked out to the porch steps, carrying a mason jar of cold, sweet tea and a plate of fresh cornbread, declaring in a firm voice that any man laboring in the midday heat required proper nourishment. Jack gratefully accepted the hospitality, sitting on the bottom step to speak with the elderly woman about the season's rainfall and county news, never once attempting to force his way into the house where Clara remained hidden behind the lace curtains, torn between the urge to hide and the desperate desire to be near him. Before departing on foot down the dusty lane, Jack left a small, thoughtful offering on the back threshold, a cluster of sweet wild plums he had gathered along the fence line, their dark purple skins still dusted with morning dew and fresh green leaves attached to their stems. Martha brought the fruit into the workshop later that afternoon, setting them gently on Clara's lap atop the unfinished weaving. Lost travelers do not spend 4 hours weeding flower beds and leaving sweet plums at the back door, the old woman said with a knowing, tender gaze. Who is he, Clara? Clara looked down at the fragrant fruit, feeling the heavy weight of a secret she could no longer bear alone. It is Jack, Mother, she confessed in a trembling whisper. He came back. He is a full colonel now, decorated with medals from across the world, and he came back here looking for me. Martha's expression softened into an emotion so profound it brought a shimmering layer of tears to her aged eyes. She remembered the bright young man who used to help mend their fences. She remembered the day he stood at the depot in his fresh uniform, and she remembered the endless years of watching her daughter wither in silent grief while insisting that everything was fine. He returned after 10 years, Martha stated softly, her voice full of quiet reverie. He came back across the world for you. He cannot possibly want this life, Mother, Clara protested, her hands gripping the armrests of her wheelchair until her knuckles turned stark white. He came back, seeking the young woman who used to run through the meadows, not a woman who cannot even walk across her own kitchen without wheels. He does not understand what this life truly means. Once the reality sets in, he will leave, and I will have to endure losing him all over again. I do not know if I have the strength to survive that a second time. Martha slowly pulled an oak chair across the floorboards, sitting directly opposite her daughter despite her aching joints. She reached out and took Clara's weaver hands into her own worn, papery palms. Listen to me, my child, Martha said, with the steady authority of a woman who had weathered 8 decades of hardship. True love does not exist only when skies are clear and paths are smooth. Real devotion crosses oceans, gets down into the mud, and repairs what was broken. You do not have the right to decide what another human soul is strong enough to carry. That is his choice to make, not yours. You took 10 years from him out of a foolish sense of martyrdom. Do not steal another single day. The weight of her mother's words sank deep into Clara's heart, lingering through the quiet hours of the night. When darkness fell over the countryside, Clara did not leave the metal tin in the dark recesses of her wardrobe. With trembling fingers, she unwrapped the calico cloth and opened the first letter in the stack, reading Jack's compact handwriting as he described the biting cold of distant outposts, the longing for home, and his enduring vision of the life they would build together in Virginia. She read through letter after letter until the early morning light began to illuminate the bedroom walls, weeping tears that began to wash away years of accumulated bitterness. Jack returned the following morning, and the morning after that, arriving with the consistency of the sunrise. He mended the low picket fence surrounding the yard, cleared the drainage ditch by the road, and spent hours under the sun restoring the garden to its former glory. On the fourth day, unwilling to remain hiding behind the window any longer, Clara gathered her courage and wheeled herself out through the back door. The small front wheels of her chair caught in the thick grass, forcing her to push with all her upper body's strength, muttering in frustration at the physical barrier. When Jack noticed and stepped forward to assist, Clara raised a firm hand, her voice ringing with stubborn pride. "I can manage it myself." Jack immediately halted mid-stride, recognizing the fierce independence behind her words, and stepped back to give her room, allowing her to reach the cleared stone patio under her own power. When she arrived, breathing heavily with garden dust clinging to her metal rims, he made no mention of the struggle. He simply smiled warmly and handed her a pair of brass pruning shears. "These climbing roses are desperately in need of trimming," he remarked casually. "They certainly are," Clara replied, marking the first time she had spoken to him without cold defensiveness. "They grow unruly and refuse to bloom properly unless you cut away the old dead wood." Jack knelt beside her wheelchair on the stone path, and together, beneath the gentle morning sun, they began the patient work of pruning the thick briars. Clara pointed out the overgrown canes while Jack carefully made the cuts, their hands occasionally brushing against each other among the leaves, causing them both to pause with the sweet awkwardness of young sweethearts. From the kitchen window, Martha watched the scene unfold, wiping a quiet tear of relief with the corner of her apron. As the morning progressed, Jack began to fill the vast silence of the lost decade. He recounted the agonizing months when his letters began to go unanswered, how he had written to the local postmaster and old acquaintances in town, only to receive vague replies that Clara and her mother were simply living quietly at home. "I convinced myself you had found someone else," Jack confessed, his voice tightening as he trimmed a thorny branch. "I thought you had moved on and forgotten our promises." I carried that sharp stone in my chest through every deployment. Clara felt a wave of profound sorrow wash over her, finally grasping the true magnitude of the pain her silence had inflicted upon him. "If you believed I had forgotten you, why on earth did you come back?" she asked softly. Jack set the shears down on the garden path, sitting entirely on the stone beside her chair, gazing out across the rolling green hills. "Because my service was completed," he said with steady conviction. "I spent 10 years rising through the ranks, commanding units, and earning decorations. But wherever I went, I carried one thing with me." He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small, worn handkerchief, carefully unfolding the linen to reveal a simple, polished gold band, its edges slightly smoothed from years of being held. "I bought this with my very first Army paycheck before I shipped out. When my contract ended, I could have accepted a permanent post at the Pentagon with comfort and prestige. But what good is any rank or honor if the only home I ever wanted is sitting in this garden? I came back to find out if this ring still had an owner." Clara looked upon the gold ring and felt the breath leave her lungs. For 10 years, while she had locked his letters away out of fear, he had carried that promise around the world. Reaching out with a trembling hand, she lightly touched the cool metal resting in his palm. The two sat together in the fragrant garden, the silent distance between them finally beginning to dissolve beneath the warm afternoon light. Yet the deep-seated fears that had governed Clara's existence for a decade could not be banished in a single afternoon. Later that evening, after Jack had walked back toward his lodging in town, a wave of familiar panic washed over her. It was easy to share tender moments amidst the blooming flowers, but what would happen when the romantic novelty wore off, replaced by the mundane, exhausting reality of caring for a woman who could not walk? The fear of being an inevitable burden gnawed at her resolve, tempting her once again to push him away before the pain of eventual abandonment destroyed what little peace she had managed to build. Her spiraling thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Thomas, their nearest neighbor, a 75-year-old widower who lived half a mile down the gravel road. Thomas had known Clara since she was a little girl playing in the clover fields, and he regularly stopped by in the late afternoons to drop off a fresh jar of raw milk from his Jersey cow. Finding Clara sitting alone on the porch with red-rimmed eyes, the old farmer sat down on the wooden steps without waiting for an invitation, setting his worn straw hat on his knee. "I hear young Jack is back in town, wearing Colonel's eagles on his shoulders," Thomas said in his slow, gravelly drawl, looking out across the quiet pasture. "Folks down at the general store cannot stop talking about it." "People talk far too much about things they do not understand," Clara muttered, staring down at her lap. Thomas chuckled softly, gazing out at the evening shadows stretching across the grass. "That is just how small country towns are, Clara. But listen here. You remember my late wife, Sarah. The last 7 years of her life, she was completely bedridden from that severe stroke, unable to move anything below her shoulders. 7 long years I lifted her, washed her, fed her every meal with a spoon, and turned her in the bed every 2 hours through the night so her skin would not break down." He paused, his voice softening with deep emotion. "Do you know what I learned from those years, child? Those 7 years were when I loved that woman the most. Not in spite of her illness, but through it. It was during that time I truly understood what love was. Giving everything without expecting anything in return except a gentle smile. I would not trade those 7 years for all the riches in this world." Clara looked at the old man, seeing the profound peace etched into the deep lines of his weathered face. "What if he grows tired of it, Thomas?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "What if Jack wakes up one day 5 years from now and realizes all the freedom and adventures he sacrificed just to be tied to my chair?" Thomas placed a heavy, calloused hand upon her shoulder, his touch filled with grandfatherly warmth. "Every marriage encounters weariness, Clara, and nearly every family faces illness sooner or later. The only thing that matters is the foundation you build upon. If that boy carried a wedding band across 10 years of military service just to come back to you, his love is strong enough to weather any storm. It is not your wheelchair that will drive that good man away. It is your own fear. And fear, unlike your spine, is something you have the power to heal." Carrying Thomas's wisdom in her heart, Clara felt a subtle transformation take root within her spirit. The following afternoon, Jack arrived with a borrowed pickup truck loaded with smooth cedar planks, nails, and carpentry tools. Without asking for praise or making a grand proclamation, he set to work in the yard, measuring, cutting, and securing a wide, low-profile wooden boardwalk that connected the back porch directly to the central flower beds. He labored through the heat of the afternoon, sweat soaking his shirt, creating a smooth, level pathway that would allow her wheelchair to glide effortlessly over the soft earth. When the final plank was secured in the golden light of the late afternoon, Jack wiped his brow and waved for Clara to come out. She rolled her chair onto the fresh cedar path, feeling the wheels turn effortlessly without sinking or catching. For the first time in 10 years, she traveled deep into the garden under her own power, gliding past the hydrangeas all the way to the farthest heritage rosebush, a place she had not reached on her own since the accident. Surrounded by the rich fragrance of crimson roses, Clara looked down at Jack, who had taken a seat on the edge of the wooden walkway beside her wheels. "Jack," she said, her voice trembling slightly with the weight of absolute honesty, "I have to tell you the complete truth. And once I say it, if you choose to take that gold band and walk away down that road, I will not hold a single grudge against you." Jack looked up at her with steady, attentive eyes, resting his hands quietly on his knees. "I am listening, Clara." Clara took a deep, steadying breath, clasping her hands tightly in her lap. "Those letters were never lost in the postal system," she confessed, the words tearing through her throat. "I received every single one of them. They are all preserved in a tin box in my bedroom. After the crash, when the doctors told me I would never walk again, I made the choice to stop writing. I believed with all my heart that I was saving you from being anchored to a broken woman. I wanted you to forget me and find a normal life. I was the one who cut the cord, Jack. 10 years of your heartache was caused entirely by my own pride and fear." She closed her eyes tightly, bracing herself for the sound of his heavy boots walking away down the wooden path, preparing for the familiar silence to claim her life once more. But instead of footsteps retreating, she heard the quiet, muffled sound of a grown man weeping. When she opened her eyes, Jack had his face buried in his calloused hands, his broad shoulders shaking with profound emotion. When he finally raised his head, there was no fury in his hazel eyes. Through the tears, his expression held an overwhelming sense of profound relief. 10 years, Jack whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. For 10 years, I believed that I had failed you, wondering what I had done to make you stop loving me. And the entire time, you loved me so fiercely that you chose to bear that crushing isolation all by yourself. He let out a soft, incredulous laugh through his tears, reaching up to take her hands into his own. You are the most stubborn, brave, and foolish woman I have ever known. I have loved you since we were 15 years old, Clara, and I will love you until my final breath. Whether you are walking or sitting, whether we are young or old, no injury and no silence will ever change what you mean to me. You should not have made that choice alone, but I forgive you completely." Clara wept openly, letting go of a decade of accumulated guilt, shame, and loneliness. Jack reached up and pulled her into a tight embrace, holding her securely as the evening sun dipped below the blue ridge of the mountains. For the first time since that fateful Sunday a decade ago, Clara felt entirely whole, not because her physical condition had changed, but because she was fully known, completely accepted, and deeply loved without reservation. The news of Jack and Clara's reunion spread across the small Virginia county like wildfire through dry pine needles. In a close-knit rural community, private lives are shared across front porches, country church pews, and the aisles of the feed store. Yet, unlike typical gossip, their story brought a profound wave of warmth and renewed hope to everyone who heard it. The decorated Army colonel, who had returned across the world to honor an old promise, and the resilient woman who had found her way back to love after years of quiet seclusion. Without any formal planning, the healing that had taken root in Clara's garden began to blossom outward into the surrounding community. It started the following Sunday, when several women from the local church visited the Blue Farmhouse, having heard about the extraordinary quality of Clara's hand-woven textiles. They placed custom orders for winter blankets and church bazaar items, marveling at the intricate patterns she created on her loom. Recognizing the rare skill she possessed, the women asked if Clara would be willing to teach their daughters and neighbors the art of traditional Appalachian weaving and natural botanical dyeing. Jack quickly went to work, widening the doorway of the workshop and building a smooth wooden ramp that allowed Clara to move freely between the house and the yard. Within weeks, the quiet workshop was transformed into a bustling center of laughter and fellowship. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, local women gathered around the wooden loom, learning how to prepare wool, extract colors from forest barks, and weave intricate heirlooms. Martha sat happily in the corner rocker, offering weaving advice and serving fresh lemonade, her spirit rejuvenated by the lively presence of neighbors. The ripple of kindness continued to expand through the town. One of Clara's weaving students brought her 12-year-old son, a quiet boy who walked with a severe limp due to a childhood illness and constantly hid behind his mother out of deep embarrassment. Clara welcomed the young boy warmly, inviting him to sit beside her at the loom to guide the wooden shuttle through the warp threads. Looking into his hesitant eyes, Clara shared the profound lesson that had taken her a decade to learn. Looking into his hesitant eyes, Clara shared the profound lesson that had taken her a decade to learn. Our physical bodies are merely the houses we live in, young man. What truly matters is the strength and beauty of the soul residing within. Never hang your head for a house that looks a little different. From that afternoon forward, the young boy walked down the town streets with his chin held high. Jack, meanwhile, found his own quiet purpose within the community. Using his carpentry skills and natural leadership, he spent his free days helping aging farmers repair collapsed barn doors, clearing storm debris from country roads, and mentoring local youth. His most meaningful work, however, was done quietly, without seeking recognition. Whenever he discovered an elderly resident or an injured veteran struggling with high porch steps in the county, Jack would arrive in his truck with lumber and tools, building sturdy access ramps free of charge. He built a ramp for old Thomas, whose knees had grown weak, another for the elementary school, and one at the front entrance of the community church, so no parishioner would ever have to be carried inside. Watching Jack secure the final handrail at the church steps, while Clara's laughter drifted from the garden across the road, Thomas sat on his front porch and smiled at Martha. That boy went overseas as a young soldier and returned as a decorated commander, the old farmer observed with misty eyes. But the bravest thing he ever accomplished was returning home to love your daughter exactly as she is. Just look at the abundance of good that has grown from that single seed of devotion. The wedding was planned for the first Saturday of June, when Clara's garden reached the absolute peak of its early summer bloom. She declined any notion of a grand banquet hall or an elaborate town ceremony, choosing instead to exchange their vows among the blossoming roses, hydrangeas, and daisies of her own backyard, in the very place where their childhood affection had begun and where their love had been resurrected. Jack embraced the plan without hesitation, affirming that the setting mattered little as long as she was the one meeting him at the end of the aisle. On the morning of the wedding, the Blue Farmhouse was filled with joyful activity. Clara's weaving students arrived early to decorate the garden, hanging hand-woven floral tapestries from the sturdy branches of the oak trees and draping the guest chairs with patterned woolen blankets they had crafted with their own hands. The entire yard became a breathtaking tapestry of vibrant blossoms and woven artistry, a collective tribute from a community that had found renewed life through Clara's resilience. Martha helped her daughter dress in a simple, elegant gown of cream linen. Over Clara's shoulders, cascading gently down the sides of the wheelchair, rested the completed wheat-colored bridal shawl she had woven during the weeks of Jack's return. When Clara looked into the full-length mirror, she did not look away. For the first time in 10 years, she saw a woman radiating dignity, grace, and undeniable beauty. Outside, the garden filled with friends, neighbors, and families from across the county. When the opening notes of the acoustic guitar drifted across the lawn, Clara appeared at the back doorway, moving smoothly down the wooden ramp and gliding along the cedar boardwalk through the sea of blossoms. She propelled her chair with strong, steady hands, her head held high, the bridal shawl glowing softly in the morning sunshine. At the center of the garden stood Jack, wearing his formal military dress uniform adorned with service medals, but his eyes were fixed entirely upon Clara, tears of profound gratitude streaming down his cheeks. As she reached the arbor, Jack knelt down on the wooden walkway to be at her exact eye level, just as he had done on the evening of his return. When the time came to exchange vows, he produced the worn gold ring that had traveled across the world, sliding it gently onto her finger. "I traveled across the world and back again," Jack declared, in a clear, resonant voice that carried across the quiet garden. "And I learned that home is not a place on a map. Home has always been you, Clara. Walking or sitting, in youth or in old age, you are my true home, and I will never leave your side." Clara looked through her joyful tears at the ring on her hand, at her mother smiling beside old Thomas, and at the community surrounding them with boundless affection. "I take you, Jack," she spoke with unwavering certainty, her voice carrying the triumph of a decade-long journey. "I take you with all my heart, as I have since the very beginning." Honor, as they shared their first kiss beneath a shower of rose petals tossed by the smiling children, the morning sun illuminated the Virginia hills, casting a warm blessing upon a steadfast love that had conquered time, physical frailty, and fear itself. In the profound journey of human existence, we often convince ourselves that our worth is defined by our physical strength, our outward perfection, or our ability to walk through life without faltering. We hide our deepest wounds behind walls of silence, believing that shielding those we love from our personal brokenness is an act of noble selflessness, when in truth, it is often our own fear of rejection that keeps us locked away in isolation. We forget that the truest and most transformative love does not demand an absence of scars. Rather, it reveals itself precisely when life becomes difficult, meeting us in the quiet valleys of our vulnerability and choosing to stay. True devotion is not measured by the ease of our circumstances, but by the willingness of one soul to kneel in the dirt alongside another, recognizing that our physical bodies are merely temporary vessels for the enduring beauty that resides within. When we finally summon the courage to tear down the walls of our pride, to speak the vulnerable truth of our hearts, and to allow ourselves to be truly seen, limitations and all, we discover that our trials were never the end of our story. Like a resilient garden waiting patiently beneath the hard frost of winter, our lives possess an extraordinary capacity to bloom once more, transforming personal sorrow into a wellspring of grace, purpose, and community that can inspire everyone around us. In the end, the world may remain challenging and unpredictable, but when we choose faith over fear and allow real love to take root, we find the profound strength to live our lives completely whole.